Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Kareem Johnson. He's a professor of psychology at Temple University, my former professor, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak with him today. Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for being here. I just first have to ask how you're doing under these circumstances and how remote teaching has been for you.
I'm doing pretty good. I'm one of the few, or one of the lucky ones, I guess, where the pandemic has in some ways been a little bit of a blessing because I have a young kind of 1 year old baby, and so actually being able to stay home and take care of him and not have to rely on things like daycare and other stuff like that has actually been a little bit of a blessing for me. And it's also really nice to see you again. I remember seeing you in our big lecture class, always very, very attentive, and so I'm doing pretty good.
Just for some context to preface our conversation, I made a short film last fall about ignorance and polarization, and I feel that it's a very important topic and a huge problem, especially in America, that no one's really taking the proper time to discuss. And that film was partially inspired by an experiment that I embarked on last summer where I started to incorporate opposing viewpoints into the media that I read and watched. And I went from about 90% to 10% skewed in a particular direction to probably 50-50, maybe 60-40, because it's really difficult. But point is, it totally changed the way that I see the world, and it encourages empathy and reduces judgment. So I wanted other people to experience that. So I thought what a great opportunity it would be to have you on my new podcast and elaborate on this a little bit, to really take a step back and analyze what's going on in America from a purely objective, unbiased, and scientific perspective. So I suppose my first question would be, is there a single principle or area of study within psychology that can largely be attributed to our inability to reach out to those that we disagree with, and our closed-mindedness and the increased polarization that we're seeing take place?
Yeah, well, we've certainly seen an increase in polarization where, people are kind of more strongly committed to the beliefs and the viewpoints that they have, and often see themselves as kind of like one team versus another team. See themselves as kind of like the good guys and the people that agree with them as the good guys, and people that disagree with them as kind of the bad guys. And so we're really seeing polarizations that are based off of the different affiliations with different kinds of groups. And what we're also seeing is the tendency for people to look for information that confirms what they already believe, and which actually makes those beliefs even stronger. In psychology, we refer to this as the confirmation bias, where we have a preference to uh, find information, look for information that already confirms what we already believe. But it actually gets a little bit worse than that, because oftentimes it's not just looking for information or believing information that we think is true. It's really looking for the information that we want to be true. And so we can really talk about something a little bit more specific called the desirability bias, where we really pay much more attention and give much more credence to the things that we hear that we wish were true, even if it comes from sources that that aren't necessarily the most reliable sources. If we're hearing what we want to hear, we're much more prone to believe it, and even more so if we can find other people that believe the same thing, and other people that tell us things that we want to believe.
It's unfortunate that this is the way that we're wired. And it's almost as if we have to resist, or kind of we have to be consciously aware of it in order to fight it, to make any sort of progress. But that seems to be the case for a lot of areas of life that bring us pleasure or satisfaction. So what sort of behavior increases the likelihood that people will become so vested in certain ideas, not just in our average opinions, but also more far-fetched, like conspiracy theories and certain areas of thought like that?
Yeah, well, a lot of it really is people being motivated to feel good about themselves, to feel good about what they believe in, and we get kind of motivated to get reinforcements of our own beliefs. At the same time, if we're challenged on our beliefs and we like want to defend ourselves and want to defend how we see the world, the more that we commit to an idea, the more that we defend it, the stronger that attitude, that belief tends to get. And so you can get this kind of tendency to be polarized, to be pushed to more of an extreme, because you want to feel good about yourself, you want to feel good about your beliefs, and when someone challenges them, you defend them. But the more you defend those beliefs, the stronger you even make them. And again, we also tend to seek out the people and the news sources and other kinds of sorts of information that confirm what we believe. It's more pleasant, it's more rewarding to, in essence, get feedback that says, I agree with you, or you know what, you're right, and other people are wrong. And the kind of reward or pleasure that we get from that kind of motivates us to keep looking for it.
What I've been realizing, especially recently, is that it's much more productive to view media with the intent of being educated and challenged rather than just seeking satisfaction. And when we spoke earlier, you mentioned that this triggers dopamine. And of course, especially from taking your class, I've heard dopamine being mentioned in other contexts, such as drug usage and stuff like that. So is that a bit far-fetched? Is that a false equivalency, or is it pretty much the same exact thing?
Well, there is something addictive about getting feedback that agrees with you, being told that, or getting feedback that says, hey, you're right. Your way of seeing things is actually the right way, and other people are wrong. Anytime we do something that leads to pleasure or reward, it kicks in what we call our dopamine system. It doesn't necessarily always have to be something as strong as addictive behavior, but the more you repeat a behavior that leads to pleasure, the more you might end up craving it, right? And so, whereas something like a drug addiction, like being addicted to morphine or heroin or something like that, is a rather extreme form of this sort of trying to activate this reward system. Something as simple as eating Oreos or potato chips can also become kind of addictive. Same thing with getting feedback about your attitudes and beliefs that are rewarding. I knew I was always right about those crooked politicians on the right or those crooked politicians on the left. And look, this news channel tells me that I'm right. And this Facebook group also tells me that I'm right. And all of those little sources of, hey, you know what? You're right. You're right. You're right. You're right. Each of those are a little bit of a dopamine reward. Just like, this potato chip is delicious, or this Oreo cookie is delicious, is a little bit of a dopamine reward. And it can even get to the point where people kind of crave it. Many people know political, quote unquote, junkies or news junkies that are always, checking their news feed to get more, sorry, I got my little phone here, but, people that, are constantly checking the news feed, scrolling up, give me another story about something, because that becomes rewarding. And so we can get addicted to it, though, of course, with something like an addictive drug, the behaviors might get much more extreme.
I want to return to the defense intention that you mentioned before. There's this apparent effort to delegitimize and talk down to the people that we disagree with, which in turn brings us a sense of satisfaction, and that in and of itself can be addictive, it seems. And as a result, there are a lot of stereotypes and generalizations being made about people based solely on superficial characteristics, such as their political affiliation, who they vote for, who they follow on social media. So basically, we're seeing people be defined by the radicals of their party, which I don't think is necessarily good in any way, because it tends to misrepresent or mischaracterize a lot of people. So to what extent do you think these vast generalizations and associations to hyperbolic language are productive to our public conversation? And do you think that they have the potential to be counterintuitive and drive us apart even further?
Well, they've certainly, name calling, viewing groups of people by the worst members of the group certainly isn't going to be productive. I mean, it's just another form of stereotyping where we're not seeing people as they are, but we're kind of seeing them in this kind of stereotypical way, and often focusing on kind of the worst examples and using them to generalize. This is another example of confirmation bias, by the way, that if I am, more conservative leaning and I, judge those that might be quote unquote more liberal but on the basis of the behavior of radical extremists, then it's easy for me to discount any viewpoint or any opinion that comes from that side. Vice versa, if I'm on the, if I'm more liberal leaning and I look at the worst offenders that are more conservative, people that are, storming the Capitol or, shouting racial epithets, and I use them to generalize to all people who might be more conservative. Again, it allows me to not have to, to listen to anyone on that side, to discredit them entirely. And again, it allows me to feel a certain amount of kind of moral superiority by using as my basis of comparison the worst on the quote unquote other side. And so again, it's again another form of confirmation bias where I choose the information that best fits what I want to believe. And if I use the worst examples, then I get to say, see, you don't even, there's no point in even talking to these people or listening to these people because they're so extreme.
It appears that we're lacking moral consistency. So, for example, say we have like a hypothetical person, like neither you nor me, who believes that political violence is bad, it's unproductive, ineffective, and it shouldn't happen. Then that person should condemn last month, certain aspects of last summer, wars overseas, and it should condemn all of it, regardless of political convenience. Likewise, if that same person believes that dictatorship is bad, they should condemn a president that fires half of his cabinet during his term. They should also condemn a president that signs like 30 executive orders in his first few weeks in office. I mean, because we're seeing from both sides people saying, well, that's dictator-like, but they're ignoring behavior or actions that could be considered dictatorship or violence on their own side just because it's politically convenient. And I don't know. Are you seeing that as well?
Oh, hypocrisy has long been a standard part of politics, where similar kinds of behaviors on one side that we would judge as, awful or immoral when done by members, again, of quote unquote our side. And unfortunately, this kind of us versus them language is so easy to it's such kind of an automatic way of describing it. Our side, their side, left, right. But we tend to be more forgiving of the sins of those that we agree with on a lot of things. And we tend to be more harsh in our judgments of others that we disagree with, even if they're engaging in similar kinds of behavior. If you were to take something like, treatment of women historically, Bill Clinton wasn't necessarily the greatest guy in his treatment of women. Donald Trump isn't necessarily the greatest guy in his treatment of women. But at the time, if you were supporting one candidate, then you tended to forgive those sins when it's, a person that you otherwise think you agree with. And so I would definitely be a proponent of consistency. But again, one of the things that we tend to do as part of our confirmation bias, as part of our desirability bias, is we kind of pick and choose what we pay attention to and ignore things that might go against what we want to believe.
There are a lot of terms being thrown around which I'm Not sure if they're really appropriate in a lot of instances. So I just want to get the definitions straight, and I think you're the perfect person to ask.
Sure.
So I'm not sure if they're exaggerations. Perhaps they are or they're not. So would this at all be similar to groupthink? Because we've seen a lot of, if you go into a textbook, there are a lot of extreme examples of groupthink as well as cults. Do you think that those terms are accurate? Because I think you can certainly make the case that there are cults and people who adhere to certain behaviors that could be defined as groupthink. But do you think that they're as abundant or ubiquitous as they are by people in media just throwing these terms around?
So groupthink specifically refers to when a group of people are making some kind of decision, and instead of trying to make the best decision, they care more about showing kind of a unified front. That they care more about showing their loyalty to the group than making the best possible decision. Cults also have a similar aspect that when you're in a cult, one of the things that is often suppressed is any tendency to express any disagreement or a lack of loyalty. You have to be loyal to the group. And so both groupthink and cults are, you know, I think are it's fair to use those terms to a certain extent when talking about something like the loyalty that is often shown by our different political parties. Of course, particular salience right now is the Republican Party and their loyalty to Donald Trump, because in essence, that's one of the things that he demands is their loyalty. And so, we're currently undergoing an impeachment trial where it's kind of a foregone conclusion that even though many Republican senators will report that they think his behavior, brought upon, the Capitol invasion, that he, in some ways, incited violence, they're going to try to find other ways to remain loyal to him and not vote against him. And there's only a few who seem to be, I would say, brave enough to express their disagreement and remain true to their convictions. Donald Trump himself is often referred to as a cult of personality because the idea of him is that people often care much more about the person and staying loyal to the person than the particular ideas that he espouses. And so he can be very inconsistent in what he says he believes, but people are loyal to him, not necessarily the beliefs that he expresses. And so, to kind of summarize, they are certainly related terms, groupthink and cults, because of the loyalty that's demanded of them and the kind of pressure for people in the groups, if they see themselves as a member of the group, a member of the party, to not feel that they can speak up any kind of disagreement.
Yeah, we also hear the term identity politics thrown around, or the idea that the world should be viewed through like group identity terms instead of just treating everyone as a human being. And I don't know if that's an accurate characterization of that. But do you think that this is relevant to these broader concepts as well?
Oh, certainly. So identity politics typically refers to, where we make political issues out of, different kinds of social groups. And so people, again, kind of define themselves in terms of their political affiliations. And again, often feel this drive to be loyal to their political affiliations. If I'm a good, loyal liberal, I do not say negative things about, Democrats or other people that are seen as liberal. If I'm a good, loyal Republican, I do not speak ill or I do not contradict, well-known Republicans. And in essence, being a member of the group, I'm a liberal. I'm a conservative becomes part of that person's identity themselves. And then again, as we had kind of discussed earlier, then people get invested in defending those political views because at the same time they're defending how they see themselves, how they define their own identity.
I'm curious, where do we draw the line in terms of addressing and defining extremism? Because a lot of what I'm seeing, for example, is the bar seems to have dropped pretty low on both sides. And of course, I think there's an area of thought in certain types of people that deserve to be considered extremists, specifically groups whose intent is solely to cause destruction and hate. But how do you think we should go about addressing extremism? And should those in Washington or Silicon Valley decide the criteria for what precisely constitutes extremism?
Yeah. So the throwing around of the label of like extremism, even in these, you know, you're just expressing a political opinion and then you're called an extremist. Again, this is another technique that is basically used to try to delegitimize the opinions that are coming from, again, quote unquote, the other side. And so if I can use a label like extremism, well, we can all agree that someone who is extreme is an extremist isn't credible. And so if I put that label upon someone, again, it gives me an avenue to discredit them. It's almost like it's similar to terms another term in psychology, which is called dehumanization, where we try to view someone like a different group as somehow less than ourselves because that allows us to be harsh or even cruel to them and not feel the same amount of guilt that we would if we were harsh and cruel to someone that was more similar to us. By throwing a label like you're an extremist on them, again, we can delegitimize them. We don't have to listen to them. We don't have to empathize with them as much. But of course, what I would define as a real extremist isn't going to be someone that protests, voices their political opinion. It would be someone that uses, you know, harsh and extreme tactics. If you are burning things down, if you are physically harming someone, if you are blowing things up, that's extremism. That is gone to a point of, irrational and kind of destructive behavior. If I am simply voicing an opinion that you disagree with or that somebody else is agree with, even if that opinion is something that I would think of as like, well, that's like outside of the norm, I wouldn't necessarily call it. I wouldn't necessarily refer to that as extremism without some kind of real extreme forms of behavior itself.
Another large problem that I see taking place is that debate is becoming more and more frowned upon instead of sitting down and having difficult conversations with those we disagree with. And we would much prefer to retreat to our own side and just cancel the debate and view that as a form of victory. Yeah. Where I think I'd argue that that's a sign of weakness when someone wants to censor other people's statements or statements made by the opposition, when you really should be making an attempt to convince them that your ideas are superior through facts and logic. So do you think that any form of censorship is a solution to this? Because we've obviously seen a lot of censorship taking place recently in an effort to prevent violence, which is the main goal behind it, or it's the reasoning behind taking the controversial action like this. So do you think that any of this is a solution?
So kind of 2 points to address in your question. You had discussed the idea that we should be having debates with people and trying to convince them through facts and logic, which I generally agree with. We want to agree in kind of we want to agree upon the same reality of the world. But unfortunately, a lot of times people's beliefs are not about facts and logic. They're about emotions. And so it's about feelings that people have. And so we really want to be effective in trying to change someone's views of things, or at least get to a better understanding between two people. We have to also acknowledge that people may hold beliefs not based on the facts or the logic, but hold beliefs based on the feeling that it gives them. And if we want to um, kind of work on having people see things differently, sometimes it's better to actually delve into their feelings a little bit more. One of the sad things about the Capitol riot was people attacking police officers, even though these same people may have criticized, someone giving like a protest for Black Lives Matter as an attack on the police. Well, that kind of, hypocrisy you could point out, but you could also try to remind them of the humanity of the police officers on both sides. And so, you know, one aspect again is just remembering that sometimes people's beliefs are not so much about facts but about feelings, and if you can try to try to understand where their feelings are coming from, you may have a window into having them hear you. When it comes to censorship, that's a tricky issue because um, a country like Germany does actually has censorship kinds of rules because, of course, they have this awful history of the Nazi movement and hate speech leading to the Holocaust, a horrific event in their history. Um, One of the sad things that is happening is we are now seeing, in essence, a business motive to promote inflammatory speech, to divide us. Radio stations and cable networks, which are making money off of trying to polarize us. In essence, trying to make two different kinds of loyal sides. But should we censor is a hard question in a country that prides itself on freedom of speech. We already have some forms of censorship. We're not going to allow people to produce like child pornography and those sorts of things that have direct harm on others. We certainly shouldn't allow the propagation of direct hate speech. But if you're just expressing an opinion that's unpopular, even if it's extreme, even if it's one that I would find offensive, I don't think we should be censoring that. But I do think we should be trying to reduce the motivation and the kind of profit motive of causing divides between us, which may be a harder thing to do. But censorship in and of itself is tricky because whoever's going to be the censor is going to have their own biases.
I think that's a very fair assessment of that. Very well said. I want to move briefly to ideology and ideological possession. So, what I'm observing among people my age, and this is only my interpretation, we're being taught not how to think critically, but rather what to think.
Yeah.
And we proceed to base intelligence solely off of our ability to re-articulate or represent the ideology that we've been taught,
Yeah.
rather than it being derived from personal experience, evidence, data, or science. And I know Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this, and I know he's a controversial figure, but I think he makes an interesting point where if you find yourself in that instance adhering so strictly to an ideology or set of principles that you're no longer an individual because you can just be replaced by someone else who thinks the exact same way, another Christian, another atheist, another conservative, another liberal. And at that point, like, why have a conversation if I can just assume something about a given person if I know two things about them? And we're believing things just because a celebrity or a university, and I think you're one of the exceptions to that because I never could tell what your opinions were in class, and I really appreciated that because a lot of professors will just shove their opinions in the faces of their students, and then it's not critical thinking at that point. It's just like, believe this because that's what I said. And just because like a talking head in the media said that it's true doesn't necessarily mean that it's true, and we have to be skeptical. So I'm curious to get your take on what's known as ideological possession. I suppose that religion would be one of the most obvious examples of this, but do you see it manifesting itself in other areas of society?
Oh,
And
yes.
do you think it's inevitable the way that we're structured socially?
I certainly don't. Well, I don't think it's inevitable. Again, I think there has been. I think individuals, I think certain kinds of individuals, certain kinds of institutions have benefited from creating these kind of extremes or these divisions in our beliefs. And I can definitely criticize both sides in this. That there is an expected loyalty that you're supposed to hold to certain kinds of ideologies. If you are a good quote unquote liberal, then there are certain things that you're supposed to believe and, in essence, be intolerant of those that don't believe it. I have seen, hostilities, of students that otherwise would describe themselves as very liberal and open-minded for those people that they disagree with. Some dehumanization on their part, and of course, I have seen it from the other side as well. But we should not be so loyal to ideology that we do not question it. I think you make the point really brilliantly, which is, it's we don't you shouldn't be teaching what people should think. You should really be teaching them how to think and how to judge information for themselves. Liberal, those that lean to the liberal side of things often may see themselves as more educated and more rational, but that's really, I think that's an unfair claim for them to make. There are lots of times when, if you were to push certain kinds of liberal beliefs to and challenge them a little bit, you would see there's a lot of inconsistencies there. And I don't mean to say controversial things, but it's really just, and I would consider myself that's, it's very open to, lots of different people and lots of different viewpoints. But if you're someone that advocates for women's rights and, but also wants to advocate for perfect, religious tolerance, then you find yourself in a bit of a pickle when trying to criticize Muslim countries that have very, very restrictive rights for women. If you want to advocate that anyone can choose what gender that they want to assign themselves to and identify with, then why should we be so harsh on someone that says that is Caucasian and says, yeah, but I really identify as African American? These, and I'm not saying there's a right or wrong answer to this, but if you allow people perfect freedom to choose to be whatever they want to be, then that should be true in all cases. And you shouldn't be, why should you be so critical with someone that says, yeah, I really kind of identify with being black? That is, it would be judged by most liberals to be unfair appropriation. But if I'm someone that was born with a masculine gender and then I say I want to identify as a woman, we don't call that appropriation. And so the loyalty that we have to our ideology should not prevent us from challenging our ideologies and seeing some of the inconsistencies. And if we allow ourselves to do that on both sides, then we actually have more empathy and appreciation for to hear the opinions that's coming from whatever the other side is.
Yeah. So again, it's like what we were talking about earlier is just people aren't being consistent, and there's so many instances of hypocrisy like that people just refuse to acknowledge.
And
Sorry,
I just wanted to add real quick because the thing that makes me the saddest about this kind of ideological possession is when it's happening actually at the university level, where, for instance, guest speakers that had been invited to schools are then disinvited because of maybe controversial statements that they had made in the past. Not extreme behaviors like they blew up a building or something like that. They said something that someone may have found offensive or that they that seemed too extreme. And I lament this because, honestly, one of the most educational experiences that I had ever in my life when I was a college student was when we had a guest speaker that was a former member of the Ku Klux Klan. and actually had talked about their history with the Klan, how they used to work as a Klan recruiter. It has left a permanent, impact on me, not because I'm going to suddenly join the Ku Klux Klan, but to see that other way of thinking, and that could lead someone to those kinds of extreme beliefs. And then to also be able to see the humanity in that person as they themselves started to realize, how their beliefs were doing more harm than good. And so that to me is the exact kind of experiences that we should be inviting, particularly for our college students.
The answer to my next question you've probably touched upon throughout our entire discussion, but just to wrap everything up, if you had to provide one takeaway for everyone listening of how we should address ignorance or the specific mindset that we should be in, or what we should realize about our inherent behavior as human beings and the human mind, what do you think that would be that would ease tensions and encourage better discourse?
In a word, empathy. Just remembering that all of us are flawed human beings, but we're human beings. That we get to the point of extremes, almost hatred for the other side when we allow ourselves to dehumanize them, to forget their humanity. Even if someone, is completely opposed to everything I believe, that's also a person that loves people, that has family like I have family, that gets hungry when they don't eat like I do. Like, we are human beings, and you know just to be mindful of the fact that someone is not a monster because they don't agree with you. Someone is, not a savage or an animal, because they hold a different opinion than yourself. And if we can start from that, we both have things that we value, that we love, that we care about. We may disagree on certain kinds of things, but can we at least start remembering that we're both human beings?
That seems like the only plausible solution to this problem. And I think it's really heartbreaking to see what's taking place. And that's mainly why I made the short film I did and why I'm trying to start a podcast, because I really want to encourage empathetic conversation and sort of have an attempt at being a part of the solution rather than just complaining about it, even if it's in a small way. And I think that a major part of addressing ignorance is simply first recognizing the extent of our own ignorance. Like, we feel we're often inclined to believe that we aren't a part of the problem in certain respects, and just acknowledging the fact that, I don't have the answers. I'm not always correct. I could be wrong, and not feeling shame at admitting that you could be wrong. And I feel like that's the only way that we're going to make progress, is reaching out to those we disagree with and avoid talking down and delegitimizing and, just like you said, dehumanizing people based on what they believe. And it's very humbling and liberating. And instead of seeing, elephants and donkeys or, whatever other ideologies or political parties we have, I'm seeing human beings now. And that's what needs to take place. And I think that realization will really go a long way for us. So again, I really appreciate you taking the time to enlighten me today. You've been so generous with your time. Thank you so much for being here, and be well.
Sure, thank you. It's been a pleasure. And if you ever need to call upon me again, I would be happy to do it.